Welcome back to my channel, the Lydia McGrew channel. Today I'm going to be discussing Bayesian inference and the resurrection, and it's going to be quite technical. I actually enjoy technical things, and I hope that you will too. A few weeks ago, by the time this video comes out, it will be a few weeks ago, I did a stream, the third of three, so that'll be the last one for quite a while, on the channel Real Seekers. The host is Dale Glover, and I was talking with a British math teacher named David Kemball-Cook, who does not believe that the bodily resurrection of Jesus occurred. And this time we were talking about Bayesian reasoning and some criticisms that he had of the article that I wrote with my husband, Tim McGrew, that was published over 10 years ago now, my goodness, over 15 years ago now, on the resurrection and a Bayesian analysis of the evidence and modeling of the evidence for the resurrection. Now that stream with Dale and David got very, very technical, very technical. And there was even a point where we were somewhat misunderstanding each other, and then we got past that misunderstanding, but we were still disagreeing about some of the implications of the mathematics and so forth. And what I wanted to do here was to discuss some of the issues at more leisure, okay? Because if you've got some interest in this, you might nonetheless have felt a little lost while watching that, and you might want to see it discussed in a more leisurely way. So here you go. One of the things we were talking about a lot was the issue of what's called a partition. Okay, now what is a partition in probability theory? Well, it's, as I defined it on the stream, it's a mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive set of hypotheses. So a very simple partition would be Jesus rose from the dead, Jesus did not rise from the dead. These cannot both be true, but also they cover all the bases, okay? You know, as long as you define what you mean by Jesus rose from the dead clearly, like rose bodily, for example, then any kind of, demons made it look like he rose from the dead or whatever, any of that's going to go under not R. He didn't rise from the dead, or the disciples just had hallucinations or whatever. That's going to go under not R. So that's a partition. You can have a three-way partition also, though. In fact, you can have as many different parts of a partition as you want. You can even have silly partitions like, Lydia exists and there are penguins in Antarctica. Lydia exists and there are no penguins in Antarctica. Lydia exists and there are... Lydia doesn't exist and there are penguins. Lydia doesn't exist and there are penguins. It's kind of a pointless, but that is a partition. You've got all the possibilities laid out there. And so part of the disagreement was this. When we're estimating what's known as the Bayes factor, which Tim and I use to model the force of the evidence, do you need to use a partition? And so that's what this is going to be about. So I want to start with the odds form of Bayes' theorem. You've seen something like that on this channel before. I'm going to bring it right up here, and as I've done before, I'm going to make just a blog post with these images so that you can take your time. This is the odds form of Bayes' theorem with a partition. So H stands for hypothesis, all right? So first you see there you have the ratio of the posteriors. That's the probability of the hypothesis over the probability of its negation, given some evidence E in question that you're talking about. Then the next ratio is called the ratio of the likelihoods. It's the probability of E given the hypothesis and the probability of E given that the hypothesis is false. So again, this is with a partition. And then you have the ratio of the priors, probability of H aside from E, that is to say, over the probability of not H aside from E. Now, in the first and last terms, as I wrote here, which is the ratio of the posteriors and the ratio of the priors. The numerator and the denominator must sum to 1. This is because all probabilities are, between 0 and 1, and if, either H occurred or it didn't, so if the probability that H occurred is, 0.01, then the probability that H didn't occur has to be 0.99. So the ratio of the priors, the numerators and denominators, the numerator and denominator have to sum to 1, and the ratio of the posteriors, the numerator and the denominator have to sum to 1. That's because we're using a partition. All right, and what this means is that if you have priors, and if you have even the ratio of the likelihoods, you don't even have to estimate the top and the bottom of that middle term, that likelihood ratio. You don't even have to estimate the top and the bottom separately, but just you have an estimate of their ratio. You can actually calculate the posterior. You can actually calculate with, the probability of, at least with, whatever estimated numbers you've plugged in there, if those are accurate, what is the actual posterior probability of H given E. All right, and that's because you're using a partition, H and not H. Now, one of the things that David Kemball-Cook and I disagreed about was this. He was saying that you should compare the resurrection hypothesis with a highly specific non-resurrection theory or a conjunction of them. So this isn't exactly perhaps the example he would use, but this gives you an idea of what would be meant by, he called it the best naturalistic alternative, all right? No bodily resurrection, plus the body was stolen, plus, Mary Magdalene and Peter, let's say, had hallucinations, plus there were elaborated stories, various elaborated stories that made their way into the Gospels that didn't happen and weren't even what the disciples originally said. And so that's your sort of best naturalistic alternative, or what some people would say is the best naturalistic alternative. There was no miracle here. There was no bodily resurrection, but all these things happened instead. All right. And his idea was you should compare R to that and make a Bayes factor, probability of the evidence given R, and then probability of the evidence given this best naturalistic alternative, instead of probability of the evidence given R, probability of the evidence given not R. And so we spent some time disagreeing about that. And what I want to do here is talk about why a partition is important in modeling the impact of historical evidence. The take-home here is using a partition to model the impact of historical evidence is the only way to tell if the evidence as a whole actually confirms a historical proposition. This is true of anything. So-and-so won the 2024 U.S. presidential election. Abraham Lincoln existed. The North won the Battle of Gettysburg. Man has walked on the moon. Jesus rose again. Okay, so in all of these cases, the only way to get a formal representation or a formal modeling in Bayesian terms of the relevant evidence is to compare the probability of the relevant evidence on the hypothesis that this really happened to the probability on the overall hypothesis that it didn't happen, which would be probability of the evidence using a partition. Now, why? Why is this important? Well, suppose that instead you were to compare the probability of the evidence given the proposition, let's say that Lincoln existed, okay, or that the North won the Battle of Gettysburg, to this much more specific sub-hypothesis of its negation. The Battle of Gettysburg didn't happen and, okay, these accounts, or the North didn't win, the South won, or something like that. It's not the case that the North won. And these accounts that said that the North won were falsified. These history books were falsified, and so forth. If you do that, the Bayes factor will be approximately equal, the top and the bottom. Okay? Why is that the case? Well, because the whole point of that not H sub 1, that non-partition negation subhypothesis, is to account for the evidence that would otherwise lead you to think that the what we might call the salient hypothesis, the hypothesis that would spring to mind at first when you look at the evidence. It looks like this is evidence for the occurrence and the North winning the Battle of Gettysburg. It's designed to accommodate that evidence. So this means that your Bayes factor, when you're not using a partition, is going to be unhelpful and uninformative. So I want to show there is, and this is important to know, and this came up in the stream, there is an odds form of Bayes' theorem without a partition, and it is indeed a theorem. And David brought this up, the ratio of the posteriors. So we're taking H1 and H2, they are not a partition. They don't sum to 1. So if H1 is the resurrection, H2 could be not the resurrection and, somebody stole the body and, Paul had a hallucination and Peter, etc. I mean, I spelled out something like this, okay? That could be your H2, okay? And of course, that doesn't cover all of the options, okay? That doesn't cover all of the actual options, because there are huge amounts of the not R space in which none of those things happen. I'm going to come back to this again, and we talked about this in our article. It's very important. The most probable thing to happen if Jesus didn't rise from the dead is nothing. The vast majority of the probability space, given that Jesus didn't rise bodily from the dead, we don't have any of this evidence, okay? It has something akin to 0 probability. It just doesn't happen, okay? So these do not sum to 1, but it is true that the ratio of their posteriors equals the ratio of their likelihoods times the ratio of their priors. So you might say, well, there you go. You've got an odds form of Bayes' theorem without a partition, so why can't we just use that if we're not going to do if we don't want to use a partition? Why isn't that, just as good? And then, you're sort of comparing the best that each has to offer and so forth. Well, the reason is that this Bayes factor, so I'm just going to give you a little picture here. That's the Bayes factor of the evidence with a non-partition. I'm designating the non-partition as H1 and H2. When they're nowhere close to a partition, and when H2 is what I'll call a piggybacking hypothesis, this Bayes factor is uninformative and it obscures the true evidential situation. In fact, that figure is, by the whole design of the issue, close to 1. I'm not saying the probabilities are close to 1, but that the ratio is close to 1, because the sub-hypothesis of the negation has been designed to give approximately the same probability to the evidence that the immediately salient hypothesis gives. Okay, so then it just becomes a wash. What that means is that Bayes factor doesn't tell you the real impact of the evidence. All right, now you might say, well, but no, you could just go ahead and calculate it, and you could see then what the posteriors are, right? You could just use that non-partition form of the odds form, and now you would know the posterior. No, that's not true. So I'm envisaging a case where these two hypotheses are nowhere near a partition, right? Jesus rose again, and Jesus didn't rise again, and all this other stuff is nowhere near a partition because there's all this additional space of not R that's not included there. When the two are nowhere near a partition, you cannot calculate a posterior. You can calculate a ratio of the posteriors, but that's very unhelpful, surprisingly enough. So, an illustration, suppose that you figure out somehow that the ratio of the posteriors is 4-1, okay? Now let's think in terms of probabilities. Here are some probabilities that you could have for H and not H that would be in a ratio 4-1. 0.4 to 0.1. 0.8 to 0.2. 0.04 to 0.01. You begin to see the issue? These are all in the ratio 4-1. Because the two hypotheses, the priors and the likelihoods, do not have to sum to 1 because this is not a partition. All you get is a ratio of the posteriors. You don't know what the ratio of what the actual posterior probabilities are. In fact, both of the non-partition hypotheses can go up conditional on E. They can both go down conditional on E, and so forth, as long as their ratio in the end is equal to the ratio of the priors times the Bayes factor, the ratio of the likelihoods. So that tells you that when you have a likelihood ratio that's approximately equal, and you don't have a partition, running an odds form of Bayes' theorem with no partition, it tells you very little about the posteriors. Now I want to contrast, and I want to just emphasize again, when you use Bayes' theorem with a partition, okay, and you estimate that Bayes factor, and you estimate priors, you can actually calculate the posteriors, the real posteriors, not just the ratio of the posteriors, because the posteriors have to sum to 1 and the priors have to sum to 1. The likelihoods don't. But in the odds form without a partition, none of these three terms have to sum to 1. None of them. And that's why it really doesn't allow you to calculate the actual posterior probabilities. Now, part of the issue here is then that you have this piggyback hypothesis. Now, what do I mean by piggyback? I want to talk about that a little more. When you have evidence that you think prima facie sounds like it's evidence for some H, you can then construct a hypothesis that mimics it. And that's what I call a piggyback. So the piggyback hypothesis would, in a sense, make it look like it happened. It would mimic the probability of the evidence given the immediately salient H, the H that you're like, oh man, that kind of looks like evidence for it. But it isn't, okay? And that's what I mean by a piggyback. So I want to compare this to a detective show, a couple of detective shows. So I've now watched, I believe, every episode of the old show Columbo, and I'm working my way through the episodes of Murder, She Wrote. And you have a lot of these complicated scenarios because that's what makes the television show interesting, right? Now, very common, almost overused in Murder, She Wrote, is that a friend of Jessica Fletcher, the detective of the show, the mystery writer, gets accused of murder. Happens a lot. She seems to have so many friends. And she's often convinced that the accused is innocent because he's her friend, and she can't believe that he would commit murder. Now, that's not irrational per se. It's not always bad evidence. Evidence of character is going to be relevant to the prior. But at the beginning of the show, it is going to require some ad hoc reasoning on Mrs. Fletcher's part. She'll say to the, policeman, who's sometimes portrayed as rather dense, "Now, Lieutenant, I've known so-and-so for 30 years, and she could never commit murder. It's completely possible that someone else came after she was seen leaving the scene of the crime and committed the crime, even if it's only 15 minutes or something, okay? Well, of course it's possible, but that is somewhat ad hoc. And, my sympathies are often with the police lieutenant in the earlier part of the show. Now, as the show goes on, of course, Jessica Fletcher is vindicated, but how is she vindicated? Because additional evidence comes in that is straightforwardly evidence for the hypothesis that her friend is innocent. And this happens a lot on Columbo, too. There will be this initial, of course, on Columbo, you know who the murderer is from the beginning. They call it a how catch 'em instead of a who done it. But there will be someone who's sort of your prima facie murderer, but that never really is the murderer, right? And so then eventually Columbo will figure out, and not only figure out who it was, but figure out how he did it, and how he conspired to frame that prima facie candidate. And what will happen in both shows is that you'll get specific evidence like the real murderer actually was there. Independently, you find out he actually was there after the innocent person who's been framed. Or a lot of times it'll happen, in Columbo especially, that you'll find some kind of elaborate activity that the real murderer has done, like, let's say, editing a surveillance tape, for example, or making phone calls from misleading locations to make it look like he has an alibi, okay? Just, really elaborate, or moving, one that just came up in an episode of Murder, She Wrote, going through this little piece of business with the person you're planning to frame to get him to leave his fingerprints on an ashtray, and then later, carefully taking that very ashtray, which Jessica Fletcher saw you handing off to this other person, and putting it in a different suite of a hotel, which, mistake, is a non-smoking suite. So what's an ashtray doing in a non-smoking suite? Okay, and then she remembers just exactly what that ashtray looked like and so forth. And so why would this person go to all this trouble to do all of these weird things if he isn't the murderer? So more evidence comes in as the show goes on, right? But initially, the hypothesis that her friend, or the first poor stooge, is innocent, and that somebody framed him, it's a piggyback hypothesis. Because you're going to have to think of, and there might be a variety of ways to do this, like, well, maybe someone framed, or you'll just say someone framed him somehow. I mean, it's blatantly piggyback hypothesis, okay? So that's what I mean by a piggyback hypothesis. And even the true thing that really happened, as in these detective shows, can be evidentially, initially, quite ad hoc, a piggyback hypothesis, not the way to bet, a worse way to look at the evidence, and then the situation only clarifies evidentially as time goes on and you get more evidence. But why is this? It's because if you find Mr. A's fingerprints on the murder weapon, that is more probable given that Mr. A is the murderer than given that Mr. A is not the murderer. It's pointless to compare Mr. A is the murderer right up front, probability of his fingerprints are on the murder weapon given that he's the murderer, to probability that that his fingerprints are on there, given that he's not the murderer and someone somehow framed him and got his fingerprints on the murder weapon. Well, of course, that's going to be equal. I mean, you designed it that way, so it tells you nothing. And that's exactly where I'm going with this. I'll say it again. The most probable thing to happen if Jesus didn't rise from the dead is nothing. Okay? All right. Just like the most probable thing to happen if Mr. A is not the murderer, you're just not going to find his fingerprints on the murder weapon unless it's, something in his house that he's handling all the time, but not some kind of, thing that you didn't even know that he owned or whatever, that there's no completely natural way for him to have it, like the ashtray. Someone was bashed on the head with this ashtray. Okay. All right. But there's a tu quoque that someone can attempt. A you also response, and David did make this response. He said, well, R, the resurrection hypothesis, is also a conjunction. So, for example, Jesus rose from the dead, and he wanted to appear to these specific disciples and not others, and the women saw him, and he appeared to Paul on the Damascus Road and so forth. So see, that's a conjunction too. So they're both great big conjunctions. Now you'll notice that we didn't do that in our Blackwell anthology. Okay, sure, in the end we do in fact believe that Jesus rose from the dead and was seen by these people, but we did not build that in to R, that he rose bodily from the dead. Okay, why? Why didn't we? Are we trying to sneak something by you or something? No. All right. We are actually prepared to acknowledge that the absolute probability of this whole conjunction of events, given that Jesus rose from the dead, is less than 0.5. Something people don't always realize is that you can have an enormously top-heavy Bayes factor, even if the evidence itself has an absolutely low probability given the hypothesis you're arguing for. Remember, whether you're using a partition or whether you aren't, the two sides of the Bayes factor, the numerator and the denominator, they don't have to sum to 1. So, yeah, I'm not saying that it was highly probable that Jesus would appear to Paul on the Damascus Road if Jesus rose from the dead. In fact, I find that a little surprising, honestly, that he did, okay? But you don't have to estimate the top and the bottom separately, and they don't have to sum to 1, and the top number probability of E given R doesn't have to be high. It doesn't have to be above 0.5. So because it's just the ratio, at that point, remember, both of these forms of Bayes' theorem that I just showed you, I said that central term, the Bayes factor, the top and bottom don't have to sum to 1. But the top can be enormously more probable or higher than the bottom. For example, if, let's say, Jesus appearing to, are having an account from Paul, that's our evidence, we have an account that, or several accounts actually, that Jesus appeared, to Paul on the Damascus Road. Let's suppose that the probability of that, given that Jesus rose from the dead, is, 0.01, but the probability given that Jesus didn't rise from the dead was 0.0001. You see, we've still got several orders of magnitude. It's still a very top-heavy Bayes factor. Okay, so what we did, we didn't beef up our hypothesis to where it would, guarantee the evidence or even highly predict the evidence. We let the probability of the evidence given R float. That's how I put it. It's not a technical term. It's a word I use. We let it float. And we estimated the factor, all right, that this is more probable, much more probable, given that Jesus rose than given that he didn't. And there's a reason for this. This is because there's a sense in which these things flow naturally. They don't have to have in specific, all those specifics don't have to have a high probability given that Jesus rose, but they flow naturally from it. What I mean by that is something like this. If Jesus rose, so here's an example, I would say probable that he would appear to somebody, and I would say it's probable that he would appear, among other things at least, to people who actually personally knew him. I don't happen to think Paul did, but so that they could verify, that it's really him. But that doesn't tell us that, he would appear specifically to his disciples when, Thomas isn't there. Thomas would doubt. Thomas would then be, change his mind, can be convinced, and so forth. You don't have to build in any of those specifics. But just like this guy's fingerprints are on the murder weapon is one kind of very natural evidence. I mean, he might have worn gloves, right? So it's not like it has a high probability, but it's something that flows naturally from the proposition that he was, in fact, the murderer. Especially, if this could have taken place quickly when he didn't have a chance to put on gloves. But regardless, it's like, yeah, you can see, okay, yeah, if he did commit the murder, it's at least, within this kind of realm of plausibility that his fingerprints would be on the murder weapon. Whereas the piggyback hypothesis has to work harder. It has to do some work. And that's what I mean by calling it piggyback, even to give to the evidence a similar probability to what is given by R. So even if the fingerprints on the murder weapon aren't all that probable, given that A is the murderer, if A is not the murderer, even to get it up to that point, you have to say, well, he's not the murderer, but someone found a way to hand him, maybe someone found a way to hand him that, or someone went and stole it from his house, and then killed the person with it or whatever. You have to kind of work. You have to put in work to say, yeah, okay, even then, you might not have found them, or they might have got accidentally wiped off or whatever, but you got to come up with something. You got to come up with some kind of story about how these fingerprints got on the murder weapon. And you see that in alternatives to the resurrection. You come up with some kind of story. Okay, why did the women, suppose we say the women actually did find the tomb empty. Well, maybe the body was stolen, or maybe they went to the wrong tomb, or maybe the body was moved. Even if you have a disjunction in there, maybe this, or maybe this, or maybe this, you still have to do some work. Because on the face of it, they come to it and they find it empty. That's at least some evidence that their testimony is at least some evidence that he rose from the dead. Okay, of finding it empty. Of course, there's a lot more to their evidence. They also testified that, they saw him and they were able to touch his feet and all of that kind of thing. So that then you have to work even harder. Okay, your piggyback has to work even harder. So this is why I don't think there is a tu quoque. We don't build in, and we are willing to not build in a specific claim, a specific story that's like part of R, like this is our R, that makes it probable that we'd have this testimony, makes it probable that we would have, the conversion of Paul and so forth. We're willing to just let those float and then look at the overall Bayes factor probability of this evidence, this cumulative evidence, all of this evidence, given that Jesus rose, given on the bottom that Jesus didn't rise. And that ends up being very informative because, again, highest probability thing to happen if Jesus didn't rise is that you wouldn't have any of this. It's nothing. Nothing would happen. Okay? And that, of course, is how it works in a case, a murder case. If you've got a lot of evidence that this guy is the murderer, and you say, wow, that really does seem a really strong case, all things considered, I believe that you are tacitly, I'm not saying people think of this mathematically, but that you're tacitly accessing that intuition that his guilt is a better explanation than its negation. Okay? Not just that it's, a better explanation than some worked up gerrymandered thing, because we could get equal likelihood if we did that, but that, come on, you've got all of this, that definitely seems like a better explanation than that he didn't do it, because if he didn't do it, you wouldn't expect to find this body of evidence. Underneath that, negation hypothesis, he is innocent, he is not guilty, there's a ton of probability space where none of this happens. He's just sitting innocently in his house at night, and he's never suspected. Okay, so I hope that lays out some of the technical material in a way that is accessible if you're interested in this kind of thing. And if you have a question, you can feel free to write to me. I'm going to make a blog post where I put these images in there like I've done before. You can kind of pore over these images a little bit more. Okay, thanks for watching. I'm Lydia McGrew.